if we can switch our path to another great mind of the 20th century, Ayn Rand. We talked about some of the similarities here, about them being fighters for freedom and fighters for capitalism. What is Ayn Rand's philosophy? If you can give a big 10,000 foot summary of objectivism.
Yeah. So she called it objectivism, she used to do this thing like, I can stand on one foot and say it. So it goes something like epistemology, reason, ethics, selfishness, politics, capitalism. That was kind of how she summarized it. So what she did, there's a couple things she did with objectivism. First of all, she says the key defining element of humanity is rationalism, the rational faculty. So that's what defines what a humanity is. Therefore, there is an objective reality that we can access and know with our reason. That's the objective epistemology. And the one social and economic system that lets rationality flower and is based upon rationality is capitalism. And then rationality only works, in her view, as an individual capacity, and that rationality teaches that what you should do is pursue your interests. And so she ends up calling that selfishness. Now, it's tricky because selfishness has so many strong and negative connotations. And she meant, I think, something closer to like self-actualization, because she really tried to create this idea and express the idea that to be truly selfish did not mean trampling on others. It meant just being motivated by your own kind of internal measures and metrics. And so in her fiction, she tries to show this by showing the false selfishness of Peter Keating, who's an architect who kind of steps over everybody to advance his career. And she says that's not true selfishness, because true selfishness would recognize it's false to take others' work and pass it off as your own. Now, the other big piece of objectivism is a very approach that's really inspired and related to Friedrich Nietzsche's idea of revaluing values, or a genealogy of morals. And so she says, what's happened here is Western culture has converged on this idea of altruism as good. Being selfless and altruistic is good. And this has led us to communism, and has led us to devalue the individual in favor of the collective. So what we need is a new moral code, which elevates selfishness, which elevates the individual, and which takes all the things that we have been told are bad and actually says they're values. This is what she's trying to do with objectivism. I mean, it is about as ambitious of an intellectual project as there can be. And that's what really draws people in. Yet at the same time, she's flying in the face of the way human morals and ethics and societies have evolved. And she's not able to single-handedly recreate them the way she wants them to be.
Yeah, I mean, she's not doing herself any favors by like taking on the words and trying to rebrand them completely.
Mm-hmm.
Like writing the virtue of selfishness. It's like, can we just call it self-actualization?
Yeah.
There's a negative connotation to selfishness and a positive connotation to altruism. So she sometimes, it seems, takes on the hardest possible form of argument.
Yeah, I mean, she had a student and who ended up being very close to her, Nathaniel Brandon, and he was sort of an advisor, and he said, can you please not use selfishness? Like, just come up with another word. But part of her liked it. Part of her wanted to provoke and unsettle. She didn't want to give that up.
I mean, people should listen to her public talks. Her whole aura, way of being is provocative, and she's a real powerhouse of an intellectual. So like, she loves the challenge, and that, just listening to her in itself is just inspiring, because you could see the individualism radiate from her.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things I found in researching and writing about her. Like, she's an incredibly unusual human being, and and so that was like her strength, right? Because she's so unusual, but it was also her downfall, because she looked to herself as a model or to get insight. about humanity, and she never quite processed how different she was from other people.
So just because we talked about Milton Friedman so much, can we just return to what to you, given everything we've said, is the interesting differences about Ayn Rand, her ideas related to Milton Friedman?
Yeah, I mean, broadly, we could put Milton Friedman and Ayn Rand in some sort of category together, but she has this focus on ethics and rationality and this desire to be revolutionary that's much stronger than Friedman. Friedman wanted to overthrow the economic consensus. He didn't want to overturn the moral basis of Western society. So she does something. So in one of Frank Knight's essays, he talks about the ethics of competition. And he says, you basically cannot build an ethics out of competition because it would be monstrous to do so. Because it would say the winner of this competition is ethically right. And that would open the door to sort of might makes right. And this is what Friedman struggles with. And he says, I can't take capitalist outcomes as ethical unto themselves. I can't do it. Doesn't feel right. And there's this line where Frank Knight says, no one would ever do this. And I was like, oh, Frank Knight, you haven't read Ayn Rand yet, you know?
Hold my beer, yeah.
You're a little too early. Because that's what she does. She takes the outcomes of capitalism and of market competition and says, these have ethical meaning. And this is where ethical meaning inheres. And it is ethical to try to succeed and to succeed in a capitalist society. Now, what she's able to do is create a fictional world in which people succeed in her fictional capitalist world through ethical behavior. And so she doesn't really have to wrestle with a capitalist world in which people succeed through fraud and corruption and, all the other things that might go into someone's success. So she creates the best possible take on success under capitalism. And then she holds that up as an ideal. And I think what's important is that so few people have done that. And she comes at a time when everybody is emphasizing the downsides of capitalism. And she says there's another way to look at it. Here are the good sides of capitalism.
And like you said, she was operating, which I really loved the phrasing of that, in the mythic register.
Yeah.
So she was constructing these characters, these capitalists, that are like the highest form, these great heroic figures, almost romanticizing them.
Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned We the Living as one of the books that you like of hers the most, but can we stay in the mythic register with The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged? What to you are some sort of memorable, inspiring moments, insightful moments from those books that may be scenes or ideas that you take away from them that are important for people to understand?
Yeah, so The Fountainhead is this story of a struggling architect, Howard Rourke, and she kind of follows his life and his career. And the message is really, it's a version of To Thine Own Self Be True, right? And Rourke's designs are too avant-garde. Nobody appreciates him. And he just keeps doing what he wants to do and is just focused on his own visions, his own genius. I think that's been really inspiring to kind of creators of all types. I think it's fairly unrealistic as a portrait of human achievement, but it's an aspirational idea. I mean, one phrase that comes to mind is there's a character, I forget which one, who is in some sort of adversarial relationship with Howard Rourke and says something to him like, well, Mr. Rourke, what do you think of me? And Rourke says, I don't think of you. And that to Rand was the ideal. You're not thinking of other people. You're an island unto yourself. You're focused on your own goals, your own capacities, and you're not doing it to impress other people or to be better than other people or to dominate other people. You're doing it because you're sort of expressing your inner soul in a way. So that has been very captivating to so many. And The Fountainhead is one of those books we talked about that causes, people read it and they make changes in their life or they feel called to their higher self.
And I think there's also the scene where Rourke, with the dean of architecture at school, that's speaking to what you're saying, I think to me is inspiring. So this is the dean of architecture that expels Rourke. Mm-hmm. And it brings him into a meeting thinking Rourke will plead for a second chance. And the dean says that Rourke's work is contrary to every principle we have tried to teach you, contrary to all established precedents and traditions of art. Do you mean to tell me that you're thinking seriously of building that way when and if you are an architect? And then in a gangster-like way, Rourke says yes. And then Dean asks, my dear fellow, who will let you? And Rourke replies, that's not the point. The point is, who will stop me?
Yes. I mean, Rand's coming from communist Russia, but it has a bit of the don't mess with Texas flavor. I might say that really resonates with this idea of anyone who's felt like they're, fighting the powers that be. It's interesting. I thought you might be going to the quote where he says something like, I inherit no tradition. I stand at the beginning of one.
Yeah.
And I really think Rand's thinking about herself, when she says that she inherits nothing. She stands at the start. But, The Fountainhead comes out in the middle of World War II, and it's not Rand is an unknown writer. This is kind of a strange book. It's, classic story. It's turned down by 12 publishers before one takes a chance on it. And Rand really loved this story. The editor who read it said, this book is great. And his boss said no. And he said, if you don't take this book, I'm quitting, And so she idolized him for doing that. So they print it and it becomes a bestseller just through word of mouth. So it's not advertised, it gets one good book review, but people tell each other how much they like this book, and it keeps printing and selling out printings. It's made into a movie. And so it lands in this time when Americans are engaged in this great collective endeavor of World War II. They're making all kinds of sacrifices for the collective. And I think paradoxically, as they do that, they're drawn to this vision of someone who doesn't have to compromise at all, who is leading their life exactly as they want to. Meanwhile, they might be sleeping on an ocean liner because they've been drafted to fight in this war. And they're reading The Fountainhead and they're feeling better about themselves. And so it's also really interesting. The Fountainhead is hugely popular in India, which is fascinating. And, talk to people about this, and they basically say, this book comes like a breath of fresh air into a very traditional and conformist culture, and people just latch onto it and they love it, and it gives them that feeling of freedom and possibility that they're hoping for.
Yeah, I mean, it really is a book. Atlas Shrugged can be a bit of that too, but it's more of the philosophy, objectivism, and the details and the nuance of that seeps into Atlas Shrugged. The Fountainhead is very much like a thing that makes you change the path of your life.
Yeah.
And that's beautiful to see, that books can have that power.
And, Rand knew that she was doing that, and she knew what she was doing. This wasn't an accident. And people say, oh, she's a bad writer. Oh, her characters are so heavy-handed. She started as a screenwriter. She started as someone who analyzed films for movie studios. She knew exactly how to manipulate plot and character and drama. And she also knew that she was writing. People say, oh, Rand is for, adolescents. Adolescent teenagers love Rand. And that's kind of who she was writing for. And she said, I'm writing for people as they start out on their life and they're thinking about who they want to be. So she's not writing, for the weary middle age. She's writing for the young who are looking for inspiration.
People say that to me sometimes about certain books like Rand, but also about The Alchemist. I know a lot of people for whom The Alchemist, and they're adults and they're brilliant people, The Alchemist changed their life. And the same can be said about The Fountainhead.
Yeah.
I sometimes get criticized for using words that are too simple. I think simple words can have power. And the cliche thing sometimes needs to be said. And sometimes, if effectively, needs to be said in an over-the-top way in the mythic register, because that's the thing that resonates with us.
Yeah.
Because we are like heroes of our own story, and
yeah.
we need to hear that message sometimes to take the bold step, to take the risk, to take the leap.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing, she knew she was doing kind of propaganda in a way. She was like, I'm doing pro-capitalist propaganda. She has a degree from the University of Leningrad. She's raised up in Soviet Russia. She said, we need to present the case for the other side in the same way. And that's what she did.
Why do you think she's so divisive? People either love her or hate her.
I mean, I think it's because of that purity that I'm willing to say, sort of, you get what you deserve, and that kind of lack of charity. And part of that in her work is because she creates this fictional world where she can set everything up just so. And so you don't have contingency or accident or bad luck, or you don't really have a lot of children. You don't have handicap. Just have this idealized world. And I think it's really infuriating for people who feel that's so inaccurate. How can you be deriving a social theory and philosophy around this? And how can you be missing what seems to many people she's missing the kind of ethical instinct or the altruistic or charitable instinct? And so they just become enraged at that, and they don't want to see anyone go that far, and they're outraged that someone went that far, that did the thing that Frank Knight said no one would do. It's very unsettling.
Would you say that's her main blind spot? The main flaw of objectivism is just how black and white it paints the world? Or if not, what would you say are the flaws of objectivism?
So, the big flaw is that it's justified through a fictional world. It's not justified through reference to the real world. It's not empirical in a way. It's not. And Rand herself would say this. She's not writing about things how they are, but how they should be. And so that idealism, it just really undermines it as a mechanism to understand where we're actually living.
And that is a big contrast with Milton Friedman, who would focus on how things are versus how things should be.
And then I think it's the problem of elevating rationality over any other mode of insight or thinking. And so what happens in Rand's life, and I describe this in some detail in the book, is she essentially creates a cult of reason around her. And people who are drawn into this cult, it's called the Collective. It's a group of young people in New York City who are drawn to her work. And she's already famous, but she's writing Atlas Shrugged. And so she's sharing drafts of Atlas Shrugged as she goes along. And one of the members of the Collective, to bring all of this together, is Alan Greenspan, who later be head of the Federal Reserve. And he's incredibly taken with her. He's one of these people who says, I was a narrow technical thinker. I never thought about ethics or politics or anything bigger until I met Ayn Rand, and she really opened my mind. So he's part of this tight-knit group. But over time, in this tight-knit group, they think of themselves, we are all individualists. We're dedicated to individualism and capitalism. We're different than everybody else. Over time, they all come to share Ayn Rand's views and opinions on everything from music to art to clothes. She gets a dining room table, and a bunch of them get the same dining room table. And it becomes incredibly conformist because they've all believed they're acting rationally. And they believe that to act rationally is to agree with Ayn Rand. And they believe there's no other way to make decisions than rationality. And so to disagree with her is to be irrational. They don't want to be irrational. So people get really caught up in this very damaging cult-like circle around her.
Plus, for a cult of reason, they get awfully emotional when there's any disagreement with Ayn Rand.
Yeah.
It's kind of hilarious. It's absurd, but it's it's also beautiful to watch. This singular figure. We've talked about several singular figures, like Frank Wright, that shakes up the world with her ideas.
Yeah.
And of course it would form a cult. And of course that cult would be full of contradictions and hypocrisies.
Yeah, it's amazing. There's so Murray Rothbard, who's a famous anarchist, falls into the Ayn Rand cult. And then he disagrees, and there's some type of show trial where he's told he's wrong about everything. And then he has a little sort of pseudo cult of his own. And two of his cult members switch over to Ayn Rand. And then one of them, to show to gesture their breaking of their relationship, mails him a dollar bill that's been torn in half. This is high theatrics, right?
Okay, sticking on the drama and the theatrics, who was Nathaniel Branden?
Oh, yes.
Can you take me through the arc of Ayn Rand's relationship with Nathaniel Branden to their dramatic falling out in 1968?
Yes. So after The Fountainhead, The Fountainhead is auctioned to be is sold to be a film. So Ayn Rand moves to Hollywood, where she's going to help in the writing of the film. She wants a lot of creative control. And then she's also still working in screenwriting and things like this. And so she gets a letter from there's a Canadian student who's written to her several times. And then he writes again and he says, I'm at UCLA. And she's like, young man, you're so full of error. Why don't you come visit me and I'll straighten you out. And so he comes and they have this real meeting of the minds. They talk all night. He comes again. He brings his girlfriend. She loves him. And they start this very intense relationship of spending every weekend at her house, basically, staying up all night, talking about ideas. He becomes completely converted to the objectivist worldview. Rand begins counseling him and his girlfriend about their relationship. Very intense thing. Then eventually they graduate from college and they both enroll in a graduate program in Columbia and they leave. And after they've left, Ayn Rand is just bereft. And within a few months, she packs up her home and she moves to New York. Mm-hmm. Here I am. I like New York better. And so that becomes the seedbed of the collective. And the Brandons, they get married. They change their name to Brandon. They've never publicly spoken on this, but many people have pointed out it has the word Rand in the name. So it's some type of acknowledgement of how important she is to them. And time goes on and romantic feelings develop between Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden, who's some 20 years her junior. And they discuss them and they realize that rationality has led them to the conclusion that they should be lovers.
Right.
Right. They've rationally decided this. But because they're rational, they need the consent, or at least to inform their partners.
They're both married.
So they call a meeting and they obtain the consent, or maybe simply inform the others of the rationality of the choice. And then they say, but this is only going to be an intellectual relationship, but we'd like a few hours alone each week. And we don't want to be deceptive, so we want you to know and approve of this. So the spouses who bought into rationality know and approve. One thing leads to another. It becomes a full romantic and sexual relationship. And although it's open within these four people, it is not open more broadly. And so in all these meetings of the collective, got Alan Greenspan, all these other people coming up, drinking coffee all night, talking, they all know that Nathaniel Branden is objectivist number one. They don't know that there's a romantic and sexual relationship happening. It's kept a secret. And then when Atlas Shrugged comes out, it's panned by reviewers. People absolutely hate this book. And Rand is not Howard Roark. She falls into a deep depression because her masterpiece has been rejected. And so then the romantic relationship ends, but the close personal relationship continues. And then over time, Branden, who's still married to his wife, begins an affair with another young woman. And at this point, he has started the Nathaniel Branden Institute to teach objectivism. And he's making good money. He's becoming quite famous.
She supported the Institute.
She supported it. Yeah. And at first, it was to help her in her depression, because he said, the world needs to recognize your genius. They missed Atlas Shrugged, but I'm going to teach them. I will bring the message. And it's very successful. It becomes its own business. It has a newsletter. It's a whole world. So that small cult around Ayn Rand expands to this whole social network. And it's very much a piece with this burgeoning conservative movement. Objectivists are involved in criticizing the draft. And, there's kind of a libertarian objectivist world going on. All of this is happening. In the meantime, Nathaniel Branden has found a new partner. And he doesn't tell Ayn Rand this because he knows she'll be upset. And so it goes on for years, and Ayn Rand knows something is going on, but she can't quite figure it out. And finally, Barbara Branden says to Nathaniel Branden, you have to tell her. This has just gone on too long. So she finds out, and the whole thing blows up, and she exiles him, and she breaks off contact with him. And nobody is ever told what happens. It's called the objective schism. Objectivism breaks in two, because some people say, how could Ayn Rand do anything wrong? And other people say, what is this letter all about? And what did Nathaniel Branden do? And I'm not just going to take her word for it. I need more information. And then a bunch of people, I've read all the accounts of this. A bunch of people are like, okay, they were having an affair. And a bunch of other people are like, no, that couldn't possibly be happening. And so the whole thing breaks up. But what I, argue in my book is actually this is to the benefit of Rand's ideas, because Rand herself was so controlling over her ideas. And now that she steps back from a public role, objectivism flows into the student libertarian movement. Some objectivists become conservatives. It just kind of spreads out more generally, and you don't have to drink the Kool-Aid. You don't have to take the official course. Nathaniel Branden goes on to be part of the self-esteem movement, sort of human potential movement, California. And Ayn Rand lives, another 10 years or so, but she doesn't do major work after that.
So since we're talking about some of the, although rationalized, some strange sexual partnerships that they were engagement in, I have to ask about the Fountainhead and the quote unquote rape scene in the Fountainhead. Was she intending to add that there to be controversial? How are we supposed to read into it? Is it a glimpse into Ayn Rand's sexuality? And maybe broadly, we can say, well, what was her view on this, on sexuality, on sex, on power dynamics and relationships?
Yeah, I mean, there's also an objectivist theory of sexuality that probably the least convincing of all the parts of objectivism. And it goes something like, your sexual desires express your highest values, and they are related in some ways to your rationality, right? Which is also related to your highest values. So for her, that explained her attraction to Nathaniel Branden, and Nathaniel Branden's attraction to her was a function of their highest values. And in fact, Branden imbibed this so deeply that the fact that he was later drawn sexually to a woman who was not particularly accomplished, but was beautiful, caused him deep anguish and guilt for being non-objectivist. So this is the objectivist theory. Then the gender politics are just crazy. And we have to kind of back up and think, okay, so who is Ayn Rand? She's born Elisa Rosenbaum in Russia. She is someone who stands out from the crowd from the beginning. She never really fits in. She's not conventionally beautiful by any stretch of the imagination. She struggles with her weight, and she doesn't consider herself to have a beautiful face. She's very independent. She meets none of the metrics of traditional femininity at all. She finds love with a man who is very handsome but very passive. Yet she writes in all her fiction about strong, manly heroes. So this seems to be like a projection. The man she's actually with is not a strong, manly hero. The hero she writes about, she probably wouldn't be able to be in the same room with them for more than 1 minute before they got in a raging argument, right? And then she develops this theory about women and men, in that a woman should worship her man, and a woman finds her true expression in worshiping the man she's with. So again, this is not at all how Ayn Rand lives her life. This is like this, I would say, a compensatory theory for her lack of ability to conform to the gender norms of her day. She then articulates them in a very strong and almost distorted and exaggerated way to compensate for the fact that she doesn't actually meet them, can't actually enact them. The rape scene, to some degree, embodies that idea that the woman should worship the man. I tend to read it more in terms of literary genre. So Rand is a screenwriter, a consumer of movies, and that rape scene is like paradigmatic for the romance genre. In other words, these like pulpy romance novels,
Yeah.
the hero rapes the
Right.
heroine, then they fall in love. That's just the trope of how it works. So it's crazy when you read it, but if you were reading a bunch of novels in this genre, you would find this is like very standard. And so, but that is a huge part of its appeal at the time. There's this feminist who hates Rand, Susan Brownmiller, and she wants to write an angry denunciation of the rape scene. So she goes to get the Fountainhead, and she's wondering, how is she ever going to find the scene in this, 800-page book? It's a library copy because she doesn't want to buy it. And it just falls open to the rape scene because everybody's gone and read it, because it's very racy and explicit for that time. So I'm almost positive she also knew that. Like, if I put in this kind of taboo breaking sex scene, that's also going to probably be why people tell their friends about it. So I think it's a mess. I think all of the gender and sexuality stuff that she states is just a total mess.
I think it also reminds me of another guy related, Friedrich Nietzsche, who had very strong opinions on women and wrote about what women's role in society should be and different power dynamics and relationships and all that kind of stuff when he himself really had trouble getting laid.
Yeah.
And so you have to sort of always maybe chuckle or take with a grain of salt the analysis of power dynamics and relationship from these figures, which failed in many regards in their own private life. You mentioned feminists. Would you consider Ayn Rand a feminist?
I mean, she's almost an anti-feminist, because she then goes on and someone writes her a letter about like, should there be a female president or something? This is like the beginning of feminism. And she says, no, no woman should ever be president, because if she's president, she wouldn't be able to look up to any man because she would be so powerful. And therefore she would be like corrupt and like rotten in the soul and like unfit to be a leader. And it just makes no sense.
But that said, she's a woman and she's one of the most powerful intellects in the 20th century.
Yeah.
And so it's the contradictions. I mean, Nietzsche is full of contradictions of this sort. That the very fact that she's one of the most powerful minds in history, to me, means that she is a feminist in the spirit she embodies, right? In what she represents.
I mean, she lived the ideals of individualism in her life and set aside gender norms in her own life, but she did not see herself as part of she did not see herself as doing this for the benefit of other women or to change society's views about women. There was no collective essence to it. So if feminism has some sort of collective aspect to it, or at least some identification, one needs to identify with a broader category of women and feel they're acting in behalf of that. She's definitely not doing that. And she did, she was fair to women in her life, promoted them in her life, but did not, she was very negative about feminism. And then because like they dress terribly, and then the other thing, it's really interesting. There's all these kind of homoerotic themes in her writing. And for that reason, many gay men were drawn to her writing. And then she would say like, homosexuals are dirty, terrible people. She would denounce people for being homosexual. So there's a whole actual literature of like gay men wrestling with Rand and how she like what she says about gay people. So yeah, it's hard to make sense of. And I just think of the enormous pressures. If I want to be charitable, I just think of the enormous pressures she was under in the culture she was raised in, the expectations that were placed upon her, and her just utter inability to meet any of them. And it came out in this very tortured set of ideals that she tried to promote. And this kind of lack of ability to introspect in herself it was probably too painful to introspect and to think about that. So she just tried to rationalize her way through it, and it came out in these very strange theories.
Why do you think that Ayn Rand is, maybe you can correct me, but as far as I can see, never mentioned in the list of great thinkers in history, or even the great thinkers of the 20th century, or even the great female thinkers of the 20th century? So you have somebody like Simone de Beauvoir, Hannah Arendt. I almost never see her in the list. If you Google those silly lists, top thinkers of the 20th century, she's not mentioned. Why is that?
A lot of people just deeply dislike Rand. They deeply dislike her ideas. They don't think they're profound because they're disconnection from other ideas and other understandings of human society. I think where you could look at them and say, these ideas are very provocative and they're very deep because she's not taking anything for granted and she's flipping everything around and forcing you to really think. To a lot of other readers, to her critics, they just look absurd. Like, how could you even make these contentions? And I think that because she's not without precedents and she's not without followers, but she doesn't knit herself into an intellectual community the way that these other thinkers do very naturally, you can see who they influence, you can see who they're in dialogue with. I think my book was one of the first to really take Rand and say, she's a figure in American history. Here's who she's connected to. Here's who she's influenced. And I got a lot of pushback for that. I think now people are more open to it, But I think the people who compile these lists really dislike her work, and they think it's shallow because they find her fiction overdrawn. They find her work in the mythic register simple. And she's also a grand systematic thinker in an age that's over systems. She's creating an inverse Marxism, right? Marx was writing in 1848. He's not a thinker of the mid 20th century. So I think that's part of it. The lack of a legacy and the dislike of what she had to say and the feeling that she's too detached. Her insights are not insights because they're too idealized rather than being rooted in a theory of human nature that people find plausible.